The evening had settled over the small English countryside like a great, soft blanket, tucking the rolling hills and ancient woods into a comfortable darkness that seemed to hum with quiet satisfaction. The last traces of sunset had faded from the sky perhaps an hour ago, leaving behind a deep indigo canvas sprinkled with the kind of stars that only appeared far away from the buzzing confusion of cities and their endless, restless lights. A crescent moon hung low on the horizon, pale and gentle, as though it too were preparing for sleep, and wished only to cast the faintest possible glow across the world below. In a small cottage at the edge of a village that had no more than a few dozen houses, a single light burned in an upstairs window. The cottage itself was old, the kind of old that meant the walls were thick and slightly uneven. The floors creaked in predictable places, and the low ceilings seemed to lean inconspiratorially when the wind blew, as if sharing secrets from centuries past. Ivy climbed the eastern wall with a slow determination that suggested it had been at the task for decades, and intended to continue for decades more. A stone chimney exhaled thin ribbons of smoke into the cool night air, carrying with it the faintest suggestion of a fire that had been carefully built and was now burning at its most gentle, most companionable level. Inside the cottage, in the room with the lit window, a woman named Eleanor sat in a worn armchair that had molded itself over the years to the specific contours of her body. She was perhaps 60 years old, though her age revealed itself not so much in lines or gray hair, but in a certain quality of stillness that she possessed, a patience that younger people seemed to have misplaced somewhere along the way. Her hair, silver white and pulled back loosely, caught the warm light of a small lamp that stood on the table beside her. She wore a cardigan the color of heather, and her feet, tucked beneath her on the chair, were clad in slippers that had been hand-knitted by someone who loved her very much. On the table beside the lamp sat a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, a pair of reading glasses folded carefully, and a thick, well-loved book. The book's spine was cracked in multiple places, its pages soft and yellowed at the edges, and the cover, though faded, still showed the unmistakable illustration of a rather stout bear wearing a short red shirt and looking out at the world with an expression of mild but persistent hopefulness. Beneath the illustration, in letters that had once been quite bold, but had since settled into a comfortable legibility, were the words, "Winnie-the Pooh" by A. Milne. Eleanor did not open the book. Not tonight. Tonight, the book served a different purpose. Tonight, it was a kind of talisman, a physical anchor to the words that she could recite from memory if she chose to. Words that she had first encountered as a child sitting on her grandfather's knee. Words that she had read aloud to her own children when they were small and resistant to the idea of sleep, and words that she now offered to the world through a pair of professional studio headphones and a microphone that stood before her on a slim stand. For Alina had, in her retirement, discovered an unexpected second calling. She read stories aloud for people who could not sleep. She recorded audiobooks specifically designed to be listened to in the dark hours of the night, her voice measured and soft, her pace deliberately slow, her tone carrying the particular warmth that comes not from performance, but from genuine affection. Her recordings had found their way to hundreds of thousands of people through the vast, invisible networks of the internet. And each night, in bedrooms and hospital rooms and hotel rooms and lonely apartments all over the world, people put on their headphones and let Alina's voice carry them away from whatever had kept them awake and toward the gentle shore of sleep. Tonight's recording was to be the full text of Winnie-the Pooh, read from beginning to end without interruption, without dramatic embellishment, without any attempt to do different voices for the different characters. Alina had learned through years of correspondence with her listeners that what they wanted was not a performance. They wanted consistency. They wanted a voice that stayed the same, that did not startle or surprise, that flowed like a slow river carrying them steadily downstream. The characters would emerge from the words themselves, from the simple genius of Milne's writing, and from the listener's own imagination, which, in the relaxed state between waking and sleeping, was far more capable of bringing a bear to life than any theatrical voice ever could. Alina adjusted the microphone slightly, bringing it a centimeter closer to her lips. She looked at the small screen of her recording equipment, where a green light pulsed steadily, indicating that everything was ready. She took a breath, let it out slowly, and then, with the quiet deliberation of someone who understood that the first words of a recording set the tone for everything that follows, she began to speak. "If you happen to have read another book about Christopher Robin," she said, her voice low and unhurried, each word given its full weight and space, "you may remember that he once had a swan, or the swan had Christopher Robin, I don't know which, and that he used to call this swan Pooh. That was a long time ago, and when we said goodbye, we took the name with us, as we didn't think the swan would want it anymore." She paused, just for a moment, letting the words settle in the air like dust motes in a shaft of afternoon light. Then she continued, "Well, when Edward Bear said that he would like an exciting name all to himself, Christopher Robin said at once, without stopping to think, that he was Winnie-the Pooh. And he was. So, as I have explained the Pooh part, I will now explain the rest of it." Outside the cottage, the wind moved through the trees with a sound like long, slow breathing. Inside, Alina read on, her voice weaving through the words with the steady rhythm of a metronome, that had been recalibrated for peace rather than precision. She did not rush. She did not linger unnecessarily. She simply allowed each sentence to unfold at its own natural pace, trusting that Milne had constructed his sentences with such care that they needed no assistance from her to achieve their proper effect. She read about how Winnie-the-Pooh lived in a forest all by himself under the name of Sanders, which meant he had the name over the door in gold letters and lived under it. She read about how Pooh's favorite thing was honey, or as he spelled it in his own particular way, honey. She read about how he would go to great lengths and considerable foolishness to obtain it, and how his expeditions, though rarely successful in the way he intended, always revealed something interesting about the world and about himself. As Alina read, her mind, trained by years of this practice, occupied only a portion of itself with the actual words. The rest of her attention was devoted to the quality of her voice, to the maintenance of its evenness, to the elimination of any tension that might creep into her throat or jaw and alter the sound. She breathed from her diaphragm, slowly and regularly, and the effect was that her reading seemed to breathe as well, each sentence rising gently and falling gently, like waves on a very calm sea. In a bedroom in London, 200 miles to the south, a young man named Thomas lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. Thomas was 34 years old and suffered from a form of insomnia that his doctor had described, with the cheerful vagueness that doctors sometimes employed when they had no useful solutions to offer, as stress-related. Thomas worked in financial services, a job that required him to spend his days staring at numbers that moved in directions that other people cared about very deeply, and his nights lying awake caring about those same numbers, despite his best efforts not to. He had tried meditation apps, herbal supplements, white noise machines, and a particularly expensive mattress that had been advertised to him with the promise that it would revolutionize his relationship with sleep. It had not. What had helped, somewhat unexpectedly, was Alina's voice. He had found her recordings by accident one night at 3 in the morning, when desperation had driven him to search for someone reading quietly for a very long time. The first recording he had tried was a collection of fairy tales, and he had fallen asleep somewhere around the second retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. Since then, he had listened to Alina read the complete works of Beatrix Potter, several volumes of English ghost stories, which, despite their subject matter, were somehow deeply soothing in her reading, and most of The Wind in the Willows. Tonight, it was Winnie-the-Pooh, and Thomas lay in the dark with his eyes closed, letting Alina's voice wash over him like warm water, feeling the tight fist of anxiety in his chest loosen, finger by finger, as Pooh walked through the forest looking for honey. Alina read the first chapter slowly, savoring the introduction of Christopher Robin and the description of the 100-acre wood. She read about the incident with the bee tree, in which Pooh attempted to disguise himself as a small black cloud in order to float up to the bee's hive with the assistance of a blue balloon. She read Pooh's song about how a cloud is a funny thing, and she read it not as a song, but as a poem, which is to say, she read it with the same steady, measured pace as everything else, allowing the humor to emerge from the words themselves, rather than from any inflection she might add. This was, Alina had come to understand over the years, one of the great secrets of reading for sleep. Humor, when delivered quietly and without emphasis, became something almost other than humor. It became a gentle surprise, a small warmth in the chest, a reason to smile in the dark without opening one's eyes. And that smile, that small, involuntary response to something charming and absurd, was one of the most effective bridges to sleep that Alina knew of. It was as though the act of recognizing something as funny required just enough cognitive engagement to distract the mind from its worries, but not enough to keep it awake. The mind registered the joke, experienced a tiny pulse of pleasure, and then, satisfied, let go. She read on through the bee tree adventure, through Pooh's eventual meeting with the ground, which was sudden and uncomfortable, through Christopher Robin's arrival, and his practical observation that the best thing about being a cloud was that you didn't have to go anywhere in particular. Alina's voice carried each sentence forward with the unhurried patience of someone walking through a garden, not to reach any particular destination, but simply for the pleasure of being in the garden. By the time she reached the end of the first chapter, in which Pooh, having been rescued from the bee tree and having consumed a satisfactory amount of honey, went home to bed, nearly 40 minutes had passed. Alina knew from experience that a significant portion of her audience would already be asleep. They would have drifted off somewhere in the middle of the bee tree chapter, perhaps during the song, perhaps during the description of Pooh floating upward with his balloon, perhaps at the precise moment when Christopher Robin said, "Silly old bear." They would not hear the end of the chapter or the beginning of the next, and that was exactly as it should be. The recording was not made to be heard in its entirety. It was made to be heard just long enough. But for those who were still awake, Alina continued. She turned the page, or rather, she reached the next section in her mental map of the text, since the physical book on the table beside her remained closed, and began the second chapter, in which Pooh goes visiting and gets into a tight place. In a hospital room in Edinburgh, a woman named Margaret listened to Alina's voice through a single earbud, the other earbud having been removed earlier in the evening by a nurse who needed to check her blood pressure. Margaret was 81 years old and was recovering from a hip replacement, an operation that her surgeon had described as routine, but which, from Margaret's perspective, had been anything but. The hospital was a place of constant noise, alarms beeping, voices in the corridor, the rattling of medication carts, the perpetual hum of machinery. And Margaret, who had spent most of her life in a quiet farmhouse in the borders, found it almost unbearable. Sleep came in fragments, brief and unsatisfying, interrupted by the clatter of some new intrusion. But Aline's voice, arriving through the earbud like a message from a calmer world, created a kind of private room within the room. Margaret could still hear the hospital, but it receded, became distant and less threatening, as though the hospital sounds were happening to someone else, somewhere else, in a life that did not entirely belong to her. And in the space that Aline's voice created, Margaret could imagine the 100-acre wood, not as a children's fantasy, but as a real place she had once known, a place of green shade and dappled light, and the particular quality of silence that exists in old forests where the trees are so thick that even the wind cannot make much noise. Margaret had never read Winnie-the Pooh to her own children. There had not been much time for reading aloud when she was raising 3 children on a farm, and the books that had been available in the nearest town were more practical than whimsical. But she had read it to herself as a girl in a borrowed copy from the mobile library that came once a fortnight, and she remembered the feeling it had given her, the feeling that the world was essentially a kind place, that its difficulties could be navigated with good humor and a little honey, and that friendship was the most reliable form of wealth. She had carried that feeling with her for 70 years, through hardship and loss, and the slow accumulation of aches and disappointments that life inevitably brought. And she was grateful, in this uncomfortable hospital bed, to be reminded of it. Aline read about Pooh's visit to Rabbit, and about Rabbit's large number of friends and relations who kept appearing from corners and behind furniture with an enthusiasm that was both endearing and, for Pooh, somewhat overwhelming. She read about the meal bread and honey, and bread and honey, and bread and honey, and about how Pooh, being a bear of very little brain but considerable appetite, ate and ate until he became stuck in Rabbit's front door. The scene was, of course, one of the most famous in all of children's literature, and Aline knew that many of her listeners would be familiar with it. But she also knew that familiarity, in the context of sleep, was not a drawback, but an advantage. There was a particular kind of comfort in hearing a story that one already knew, a comfort that came from the absence of suspense. When you did not know what was going to happen next, a small part of your mind stayed alert, watching for clues, trying to anticipate. But when you knew the story, that part of your mind could relax, could let down its guard, could stop performing its duty and simply exist. And in that state of unguarded existence, sleep found it much easier to arrive. She read about the emergency council that Rabbit convened, and about the various impractical solutions that were proposed, and about Christopher Robin's arrival with the calm, practical suggestion that the best thing to do was to wait for Pooh to get thin again. She read about the week of waiting, during which Pooh was read to through the hole where his front had been, and about the eventual moment when he was pulled free with a satisfying pop that sent him flying into the gorse bush. And as she read, her voice never changed. It did not quicken during the crisis of Pooh being stuck, nor did it adopt a conspiratorial tone during the discussion of what to do. It simply continued, steady and warm, like a fire that had been built well and needed no tending. In a small apartment in Tokyo, a woman named Yuki lay on her futon with her phone on the pillow beside her, Aliner's voice emerging from it at a volume just above a whisper. Yuki did not understand English, not fully, but she had studied it in school and could follow the general shape of what Aliner was saying, could catch familiar words and phrases and piece together a rough understanding of the narrative. She had discovered Aliner's recordings through a recommendation on a Japanese sleep aid forum, where several users had described the experience of listening to a language they only partially understood as uniquely effective for falling asleep. There was something about the way the incompletely understood words floated past, recognizable but not fully grasped, that bypassed the analytical mind entirely and spoke directly to whatever part of the brain was responsible for the transition between waking and sleeping. Yuki worked as a graphic designer and often found herself at her computer late into the night, refining layouts and adjusting color values with a precision that her clients demanded. But that left her mind buzzing with a kind of visual static that made sleep difficult to achieve. She had tried the standard Japanese sleep recordings, the sound of rain, the crackle of a fireplace, the gentle rhythm of a train journey. But they had not worked for her. Her mind, accustomed to processing visual information, would begin to construct images from the sounds, and those images would evolve into design concepts. And before she knew it, she would be sitting up in bed, reaching for her sketchbook. But Aliner's voice, speaking in a language that Yuki could follow just enough to be engaged, but not enough to be triggered into full comprehension, created a different effect. The words entered her mind not as meaning, but as texture, a warm, continuous fabric of sound that she could wrap around herself without examining too closely. Occasionally, a word would surface with full clarity: honey, forest, bear, friend, and these words, stripped of their grammatical context, became almost abstract, like symbols in a dream. They meant something, but not something that could be pinned down or put to use. They were, in the truest sense, words that existed only to be heard, not to be understood. Yuki closed her eyes and let the words wash over her. And within 20 minutes, she was asleep. Back in the cottage, Alina continued to read. She was now in the 3rd chapter, in which Pooh and Piglet go hunting and nearly catch a woozle. She read about Piglet's nervousness, about the way he followed Pooh through the snow because he wanted company, but was not entirely sure that company was worth the risk of whatever they might encounter. She read about the tracks in the snow and about how Pooh's increasingly elaborate deductions about whose tracks they were and how many animals had made them led them both into a state of escalating anxiety that was resolved. As so many things in the 100-acre wood were resolved by the arrival of Christopher Robin, who pointed out that they had been walking in circles around their own footprints. Alina paused briefly between chapters, allowing a silence of perhaps 5 seconds to pass. This was a technique she had developed early in her recording career, and it served multiple purposes. First, it gave listeners who had drifted into a light sleep a moment of quiet in which that sleep could deepen without being tethered to the sound of her voice. Second, it created a subtle structural rhythm that mirrored, at a greatly reduced scale, the natural cycle of breathing. Inhale, voice. Exhale, silence. Inhale, voice. Exhale, silence. And this rhythm, sustained over the course of an hour or more, had a somatic effect that was difficult to explain, but easy to feel. Third, it allowed Alina herself to take a drink of water, to swallow, to adjust her posture, to perform the small maintenance tasks that prevented her voice from fatiguing. She took a sip of the cold tea without noticing or caring that it was cold, set the cup back down, and began the 4th chapter, in which Eeyore loses a tail and Pooh finds one. Eeyore, Alina had always felt, was the character who most rewarded the kind of reading she did. In a more theatrical performance, Eeyore's gloom could be played for laughs, his dolorous observations delivered with a sighing resignation that highlighted their comic contrast with the general cheerfulness of the other animals. But in Alina's reading, Eeyore's sadness was allowed to exist as actual sadness, not diluted by humor, but simply presented alongside it, the way real sadness often exists in real life, not as the opposite of happiness, but as its neighbor, present in the same room, sitting in the same chair, looking out the same window. When Alina read Eeyore's words, "It's not very pleasant in here," he said about his stick house, "but it is the only house I've got." She did not make them sound funny or pathetic. She made them sound true. And in making them sound true, she allowed her listeners to hear, perhaps for the first time since childhood, the genuine emotional depth that Milne had embedded in these ostensibly simple stories. This was another thing that Alina had come to understand about reading for sleep. The state of mind that preceded sleep was, in many ways, similar to the state of mind that children inhabited when they first heard these stories. It was a state of openness, of reduced defensiveness, of willingness to accept things as they were presented without the constant adult impulse to categorize, analyze, and judge. In this state, the sad donkey was not a comic device, but a fellow creature, and his quiet acceptance of his circumstances was not something to be mocked, but something to be recognized, perhaps even to be learned from. Alina read about how Pooh went to Owl to ask for advice about Eeyore's tale, and about how Owl, despite his reputation for wisdom, was not actually much help, being the kind of person who used long words without being entirely sure of their meaning. She read about the search for the tale, and about how Pooh eventually found it being used as a bell rope outside Owl's house, and about how Christopher Robin nailed it back onto Eeyore, who was pleased but careful not to show it too openly, because that was not Eeyore's way. The night deepened around the cottage. The wind, which had been whispering through the trees, settled into silence, as though it too had decided that now was not the time for making noise. The fire in the grate had burned down to a bed of glowing embers that radiated warmth without the need for flame. The moon had moved across the sky and now stood directly above the cottage, looking down through the window at Alina in her armchair, a small figure in a pool of light, reading to the darkness. In a suburb of Sydney, Australia, where it was already mid-morning of the next day, a night shift nurse named Sarah was listening to Alina's recording as she drove home from the hospital. Sarah worked 12-hour shifts that ended at 7 in the morning, and the drive home was a liminal space that she had learned to navigate with great care. If she listened to music, she became energized and arrived home wide awake, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. If she listened to the radio, the news and talk shows filled her mind with the world's troubles, which were the opposite of what she needed after a night of dealing with illness and suffering. If she drove in silence, her mind would begin to replay the events of the shift, the patient who had coded and been revived, the family she had had to comfort, the mistake she had nearly made with a medication dosage. And these replays would keep her awake for hours after she got home. Alina's voice, playing through her car's speakers at a low volume, provided the exact balance that Sarah needed. It was engaging enough to prevent the shift replays from taking hold, but not engaging enough to keep her awake. It was, she had come to think of it, like having someone sit beside her in the car who was telling her a long, pleasant story that she did not need to respond to. The social part of her brain, the part that always felt it should be contributing to a conversation, could relax, because Aliner's monologue required nothing from her. She could simply listen, or half listen, and let the words create a gentle fog between herself and the morning traffic. Sarah pulled into her driveway as Aliner was reading the 5th chapter, in which Piglet meets a heffalump. She sat in the car for a few extra minutes, not wanting to break the spell. And then, when she could no longer justify staying in the driveway, she carried her phone inside, put on her sleep mask, and lay down on the bed with Aliner's voice still playing. She was asleep within 10 minutes. The story of Piglet's elaborate heffalump trap fading into a dream in which she was walking through a forest that smelled like honey and eucalyptus, and where nothing bad could happen because Christopher Robin was somewhere nearby, though she could not see him. Aliner, unaware of Sarah, or Thomas, or Margaret, or Yuki, or the thousands of others who were listening to her voice at this very moment, continued to read. She was now well into the book, past the introductions of the main characters, and into the more complex middle chapters where the stories began to overlap and the relationships between the animals deepened. She read the 6th chapter, in which Eeyore has a birthday and gets 2 presents, and she read it with the same steady calm that she had brought to everything that came before, but with an almost imperceptible softening, a slight increase in warmth that she could not have explained if asked, but that seemed to arise naturally from the material itself. The birthday chapter was, Aliner had always thought, one of the most emotionally sophisticated things in English children's literature. On its surface, it was a simple story about a sad donkey who receives a burst balloon which has burst and an empty honey pot which has been eaten for his birthday, and who manages to be pleased with both of them because he recognizes that they were given with love. But beneath the surface, it was a meditation on the nature of giving and receiving, on the gap between intention and outcome, on the courage it takes to be vulnerable enough to receive a gift, and on the peculiar human or animal capacity to find value in something that, by any objective measure, is valueless. Aliner read about how Pooh had eaten the honey that was meant to be Eeyore's present, and had then tried to fill the pot with something else, mud, as it turned out, which was not an improvement, and about how Piglet had burst the balloon by falling on it, and about how both of them felt terrible about their failures. She read about how they went to Eeyore's house together, and about how Eeyore, upon receiving the useless presents, managed to say, in his own understated way, that they were just what he wanted. And Aliner knew, from years of reading this chapter to people in the dark, that this was the moment when many of her listeners cried. Not sobbing, not dramatic weeping, but a quiet, involuntary release of tears that came from a place deeper than sadness, a place that recognized, in Eeyore's gracious acceptance of a burst balloon, something universal about the human experience of receiving imperfect love and choosing to cherish it anyway. She did not alter her voice for this moment. She did not slow down or add a tremor of emotion. She simply continued, and in that continuation, in that refusal to highlight or emphasize, she honored the restraint that Milne had written into the scene. The tears, if they came because the words were allowed to speak for themselves, without a mediator telling the listener how to feel about them. The recording continued. Alina read the 7th chapter, in which Kanga and Rue come to the forest, and rabbits plot to kidnap Rue and turn him into a changed animal. She read about Piglet's role in the plan, about his brave attempt to be courageous despite being terribly frightened, and about how the whole scheme unraveled in a way that left everyone, including Rabbit, slightly better than they had been before, though no one would have admitted it. She read the 8th chapter, in which Christopher Robin leads an expedition to the North Pole. She read about the preparations, which were elaborate and largely unnecessary, and about the journey itself, which involved a great deal of walking and very little arriving. She read about the various discoveries made along the way: a stream, a waterfall, a pile of stones, each of which was briefly considered as a possible North Pole and then rejected. And she read about the final discovery, when Pooh found a long pole stuck in the ground, and Christopher Robin declared it to be the North Pole, not because it actually was the North Pole, but because it served the purpose of being the North Pole, which, in the 100-acre wood, amounted to the same thing. This, Alina thought, as she read the passage, was perhaps the central philosophical insight of the entire book: that the thing you are looking for is often the thing you find, and that the difference between finding it and not finding it is mostly a matter of deciding that what you have found is, in fact, what you were looking for. It was an insight that applied with equal force to sleep. She reflected. People who could not sleep were often people who were looking for something specific, a particular quality of unconsciousness, a particular freedom from thought. And because they were looking for it so intensely, they could not find it. But if they could be persuaded by a voice reading about a bear and a pole to stop looking quite so hard, then sleep would find them, as the North Pole found Pooh in the most ordinary and unexpected of places. The hours passed. The fire in the grate went out entirely, the embers cooling from orange to gray to a darkness that was indistinguishable from the darkness of the ash around them. The moon continued its slow arc across the sky, and the stars shifted their positions by imperceptible degrees. The village slept, and the countryside slept, and the whole world, it seemed, had settled into a state of profound and peaceful rest. Inside the cottage, Alina read on. Her voice had settled into a rhythm so steady, so reliable, that it seemed almost mechanical, except for the warmth that no machine could have replicated. She was reading the 9th chapter now, in which Piglet is entirely surrounded by water. She read about the flood that followed the rain, about how Piglet's house was surrounded by a growing body of water that cut him off from the rest of the forest, about how he wrote a message for help, put it in a bottle, and threw it into the water with the hope that it would reach someone who could save him. She read about how Pooh, who had also been affected by the flood, had spent the night on top of a tree with 10 pots of honey, and about how he had eaten his way through all 10 pots during the night, which meant that by morning he had nothing to eat and a considerable emptiness inside him, both literally and figuratively. She read about how Christopher Robin came to rescue them both in an umbrella that served as a boat, and about how they sailed across the flooded forest together, encountering various creatures in various states of aquatic distress. The flood chapter was one of the longer ones, and Alina knew that its length, combined with its relatively low-stakes adventure, no one was ever in real danger, not in the 100-acre wood, made it particularly effective for deepening sleep. Listeners who had been hovering in the shallow waters of drowsiness would often, during this chapter, finally slip beneath the surface into proper, restorative sleep. The rhythm of the narrative, the gentle bobbing on the water, the steady rowing of the umbrella boat, the repetitive reassurance that everything would be all right, mimicked the rhythm of the body itself as it relaxed into sleep. The slowing heartbeat, the deepening breath, the progressive release of muscle tension. Alina read the 10th chapter, in which Christopher Robin gives a Pooh party. She read about the celebration of Pooh's heroism during the flood, about the special poem that Christopher Robin wrote for the occasion, and about the general atmosphere of happiness and mutual appreciation that pervaded the party. She read the poem, which was, like all the poems in the book, a small masterpiece of comic verse, and she read it in the same voice she had used for everything else, which had the effect of making the poem feel not like a performance, but like a natural extension of the prose, a song that the story had been quietly humming to itself all along, and finally decided to sing out loud. She read the final chapter of the book, the one in which Christopher Robin and Pooh go to an enchanted place at the top of the forest. And Christopher Robin asks Pooh to understand something that Pooh, being a bear of very little brain, cannot quite grasp. Alina had always found this chapter the most difficult to read, not because it was technically challenging, but because it carried an emotional weight that required her to maintain her composure while reading words that seemed designed with a gentle but ruthless precision to break that composure. She read about the climb to the enchanted place, about the view from the top, about the way the forest spread out below them like a map of all the adventures they had ever had. She read about Christopher Robin's acknowledgement that he would not always be there, that he was growing up and would soon be going to places where bears could not follow. She read about Pooh's patient, confused, but ultimately accepting response, and about the final conversation between them, in which Christopher Robin asked Pooh to promise to always remember him. And Pooh, not understanding but agreeing, because that was what friends did. Aliner's voice did not waver. She had read this chapter many times, and she had learned that the way to honor it was not to cry over it, but to give it the same steady treatment she gave to everything else. The sadness was there, unmistakably there, but it was a sadness that belonged to the reader, not to the reader. By keeping her voice even, she allowed each listener to experience their own sadness in their own way, without being told how or how much to feel. She read the final lines of the book. But wherever they go, and whatever happens to them on the way, in that enchanted place on the top of the forest, a little boy and his bear will always be playing. And then she stopped. The silence that followed was not empty, but full. The way the silence after a piece of music is full, containing within it the echo of everything that has just been heard. Aliner sat perfectly still for a long moment, letting the silence do its work. Then, very quietly, she said, "Good night," and reached over to stop the recording. The green light on her equipment stopped pulsing. The cottage was silent. Aliner removed her headphones, set them on the table beside the cold tea and the closed book, and leaned back in her armchair. She did not move for several minutes. She sat in the darkness, feeling the particular kind of tiredness that came from reading aloud for several hours. Not physical exhaustion, exactly, but a gentle depletion, as though she had been pouring something out of herself and now needed time to refill. She thought, as she often did after finishing a recording, about the people who had been listening. She did not know most of them, would never know most of them, but she felt connected to them nonetheless. They were, all of them, alone in the dark when they put on their headphones and pressed play. They were, all of them, seeking the same thing, not entertainment, not distraction, but a kind of companionship that did not require anything of them, and she had provided it, or tried to, using nothing more than her voice and a story about a bear who liked honey. Aliner stood up slowly, her joints protesting slightly after so long in the chair, and made her way to the kitchen. She did not turn on any lights, navigating by memory through the small space. She filled the kettle and set it to boil, and while she waited, she looked out the window at the night. The moon was lower now, and the first pale suggestion of dawn was visible on the eastern horizon, a thin line of gray-green light that separated the land from the sky, like the edge of a page being turned. The kettle boiled. Alina made a fresh cup of tea, properly hot this time, and carried it back to the living room. She sat down in her armchair, pulled her cardigan more tightly around her shoulders, and looked at the book on the table, Winnie-the Pooh. She picked it up, opened it to a random page, and let her eyes rest on the words without reading them. She did not need to read them. She could feel them, the way you can feel a song that you know by heart, even when it's not playing. She thought about her grandfather, who had first read her these stories, and who had been dead for 40 years. She thought about her children, who were grown now and lived in different cities, and who called her on Sundays. She thought about the thousands of strangers who had let her voice into their most private moments, their sleepless nights, their hospital beds, their long drives home from difficult shifts, and who had, in some small way, become less strange to her through that sharing. The dawn continued to advance, slowly and without fuss, the way everything worthwhile seemed to advance in the 100-acre wood. The sky lightened from indigo to gray to a pale, washed blue, and the first birds began to sing, tentatively at first, as though testing whether the world was ready for sound again. Alina sipped her tea and listened to them, and the sound of the birds mixed in her mind with the sound of her own voice, still echoing faintly from the recording she had just made, reading about a bear who went to the top of the forest and found that the view was worth the climb. She closed the book, set it back on the table, and closed her eyes. She was tired, but it was a good tired, the tiredness of a thing well done. She did not try to sleep. She seldom slept during the day, no matter how tired she was, but she allowed herself to rest, to sit in the quiet morning light and let her mind wander where it would. It wandered, not surprisingly, back to the forest. She thought about the 100-acre wood not as a fictional place, but as a state of being, a condition of the mind that existed somewhere between waking and sleeping, between childhood and adulthood, between the world as it was and the world as it might be if you were kind enough and patient enough to see it clearly. She thought about how Pooh, for all his supposed simplicity, understood things that the smarter characters did not. That honey was worth pursuing even when the pursuit was foolish. That a friend who came to visit you was more important than whatever you were doing when they arrived. That being stuck in a door was not the worst thing that could happen to a bear, because the worst thing that could happen to a bear was to be alone, and Pooh was never alone. She thought about Piglet, who was afraid of everything, but who went everywhere anyway, not because he had conquered his fear, but because his love for his friends was slightly larger than his fear of the world. She thought about Eeyore, who had every reason to be miserable, but who chose, in his own quiet way, to keep going, to keep showing up, to keep accepting the imperfect gifts that life offered him. She thought about Rabbit, who was always organizing things and always convinced that if everyone would just do as he said, everything would be fine, and who was always, inevitably, proved wrong. She thought about Owl, who was admired for his intelligence, but who was, when it came down to it, not particularly intelligent, and who nevertheless provided something valuable simply by being there, by being the one that others turned to when they needed someone to sound wise. She thought about Kanga and Roo, about the maternal love that Kanga carried with her like a pouch, always close, always ready, and about Roo's fearless curiosity that led him into adventures that his mother would have preferred he avoid, but that she allowed him to have because she understood, in a way that Roo did not, that growing up meant taking small risks in the presence of someone who would catch you if you fell. And she thought about Christopher Robin, who was the bridge between the animal world and the human world, who could talk to bears and donkeys and pigs and kangaroos, but who would one day stop talking to them, not because he stopped loving them, but because the world had other plans for him. Christopher Robin was, Alina had always felt, the most heartbreaking character in the book, not because anything bad happened to him, but because the thing that was going to happen to him, growing up, was both inevitable and, in a quiet way, tragic. He would leave the forest. He would leave the animals. He would leave the enchanted place. And he would carry with him, for the rest of his life, the memory of a time when the world was small enough to fit inside a wood, and when the only thing you needed to be happy was a bear who liked honey and a boy who loved you. The morning light had grown stronger now, filling the cottage with a soft golden glow that made the dust particles in the air look like tiny, slow-moving stars. Alina opened her eyes and looked at the room she had lived in for 30 years. She saw the bookshelves, crammed with volumes that she had read and reread until they were as familiar as old friends. She saw the fireplace, now cold, but still carrying the faint smell of last night's fire. She saw the armchair, worn smooth by years of sitting, and the small table with its lamp, and its cold tea, and its closed book. She stood up, took her cup to the kitchen, and washed it in the sink. She opened the back door and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The garden was small but wild, full of plants that had been allowed to grow where they chose rather than where they were told. A robin landed on the fence post and regarded her with the frank appraisal that robins always seemed to employ. Alina regarded it back. "Good morning," she said. The robin flew away. Alina smiled and went back inside. She had things to do today, errands to run, a phone call to make, dinner to prepare, the small, necessary tasks that filled the hours between one night's reading and the next. But for now, in this quiet interval between darkness and daylight, between the world of the story and the world of the everyday, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She thought about the people who were, even now, waking up in various parts of the world, taking off their headphones, rubbing their eyes, and beginning the process of re-entering the waking world. Some of them would remember what they had heard, fragments of Pooh, echoes of Piglet, a lingering sense of the forest, and some would remember nothing, would carry only the unconscious residue of a story that had done its work in the darkness while they slept. Both outcomes were fine. Both outcomes were, in fact, the point. For the story was not the point. The voice was not the point. The point was the sleep itself, the deep, restorative, necessary sleep that every human being required, and that so many human beings were denied, not by illness or circumstance alone, but by the relentless, chattering, anxious machinery of their own minds. Aliner's recordings did not cure insomnia. They did not address its root causes, whatever those might be: stress, trauma, biology, environment. But they provided a bridge, a temporary passage from the waking mind to the sleeping mind, built out of nothing more than words spoken softly in the dark. And if those words happened to be the words of a story about a bear who lived in a wood and loved his friends and believed that honey was the answer to most of life's problems, then so much the better. Because Winnie-the Pooh, understood properly, was not a children's story at all. It was a story about what it meant to be alive in a world that was often confusing, sometimes frightening, and occasionally wonderful, and about how the best response to that world was not wisdom or strength or cleverness, but simply kindness, delivered with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of heart. Aliner finished her morning tasks, ate a modest breakfast, and sat down at her computer to upload the recording. The file was large, several hours of audio, and it took a while to process. While she waited, she scrolled through the messages that had arrived overnight from her listeners. Most of them were brief. Fell asleep in 10 minutes. Thank you. Best sleep I've had in months. Your voice is magic. And she read them with the quiet gratitude of someone who understood that these messages were not really about her, but about the experience that her voice had facilitated. A few were longer, more personal, containing details about the listener's life that they had felt safe enough to share because the relationship between a late-night listener and a late-night reader was, by its nature, intimate and anonymous in equal measure. Aliner read these carefully and responded to each one, not with advice or platitudes, but with a simple acknowledgement. Thank you for telling me. I'm glad the recording helped. Good night. The upload completed. Aliner typed a title for the recording: Winnie-the Pooh Full Audiobook for Sleep. She added a brief description: the complete text of A. Milne's Winnie-the Pooh, read slowly and softly for sleep. No music, no sound effects, just the story. She attached the teddy bear emoji and the sleep emoji because she had learned that these small visual signals helped people find her recordings among the vast ocean of content that existed online, and because they accurately represented what the recording was. She clicked publish, and the recording disappeared into the digital ether, where it would begin its quiet journey to the people who needed it, to the insomniacs and the anxious and the grieving and the lonely and the tired, to the children who were afraid of the dark and the adults who were afraid of the light, to anyone, anywhere, who could not sleep and who was willing, for a few hours, to trust a stranger's voice to carry them to the place where sleep lived. Alina closed her laptop, went upstairs, and lay down on her bed. She did not put on any recordings. She did not need to. She closed her eyes and let the silence of the cottage settle around her like a second blanket. And within minutes, she was asleep. She did not dream of the 100-acre wood, or if she did not remember it. She slept the way the animals in the forest slept, simply, deeply, and without anxiety. And when she woke, several hours later, it was afternoon, and the light in the room had the golden quality of late autumn. And for a moment, before she fully remembered where she was and what day it was, she felt something that she could only describe with the limited vocabulary available for such things, as a kind of honeyness, a warmth in the chest, a sweetness in the air, a sense that the world, despite everything, was essentially good, and that tomorrow night she would sit in her armchair and read again, and the people who needed to hear her voice would hear it. And somewhere, in the space between the words and the silence, sleep would happen. It was not a grand thing. It was not a heroic thing. It was, in fact, a very small thing. A woman reading a children's book in a cottage in the English countryside, speaking softly into a microphone while the world slept around her. But small things, as a certain bear had once demonstrated, could be surprisingly important. A pot of honey could be a lifeline. A burst balloon could be a gift. A walk through the snow could be an adventure, and a voice in the dark, reading about these small things, could be the difference between a night spent staring at the ceiling and a night spent in the gentle, healing arms of sleep. And that, as Pooh himself might have said, was that. The recording had been live for 3 days when the first wave of messages arrived in earnest. Alina had expected the usual trickle, the brief thank yous, the emoji-only responses, the occasional request for a specific title. But what came instead was something closer to a tide. Her inbox, which she checked each morning over a second cup of tea, filled with messages from people who had listened to the Winnie-the Pooh recording and who wanted, for reasons they could not always articulate, to tell her what it had meant to them, not what it had done for them, though many of them mentioned that too, the falling asleep, the staying asleep, the waking refreshed, but what it had meant. There was a difference. Alina had come to understand between the functional value of a sleep recording and its emotional value, and it was the emotional value that people wrote to her about. The falling asleep was assumed, taken for granted, almost beside the point. What they wanted to talk about was how it had felt to lie in the dark and hear, after years or even decades, the words of a story they had half forgotten, spoken in a voice that treated those words with the same tender seriousness that they remembered from their own childhoods, or wished they remembered, or had never experienced, but recognized instinctively as something good and right and true. A woman in Dublin wrote to say that she had not slept through the night since her mother's death 6 months earlier, but that she had slept for 7 uninterrupted hours while listening to the recording, and that when she woke, she had felt, for the first time since the funeral, that it was possible to endure the day ahead. She did not say that the recording had cured her grief. She said that it had given her a night in which the grief had been set aside, not erased, but temporarily released, like a hand that had been gripping something too tightly for too long, and had finally, for a few hours, let go. A man in New York wrote to say that he was a soldier recently returned from overseas, and that he had been prescribed medication for insomnia, but preferred Aliner's recordings because the medication left him feeling groggy and disconnected in the morning, whereas the recordings left him feeling as though he had actually rested. He said that he had listened to the Winnie-the Pooh recording 3 nights in a row, and that each night he had fallen asleep during a different chapter. First the bee tree, then the flood, then the birthday, and that he had come to think of this progression as a kind of map of his own recovery, though he could not have explained what he meant by that and did not try. A teenager in Seoul wrote, in careful English that suggested she had spent a long time composing the message, to say that she was preparing for university entrance exams, and that the pressure was so intense that she had developed a habit of lying awake at night going over everything she had studied, unable to stop, unable to rest, caught in a loop of anxiety that her teachers called examination stress, and that she called being trapped inside my own head. She said that Aliner's voice had given her something to focus on that was not an exam, something that was not useful or productive or relevant to her future in any way, and that precisely because it was none of those things, it had been the most helpful thing she had found. She said she did not understand English well enough to follow the story completely, but that she understood enough, and that what she understood was enough. Aliner read these messages in the morning light of her cottage, sitting at the small table in her kitchen with her tea growing cold beside her. And she felt what she always felt when she read them, a mixture of gratitude and humility, and a kind of solemn wonder that her voice, this ordinary instrument that she had used for 60-odd years to say ordinary things. Good morning. How are you? Pass the butter. I love you could become, in the darkness of other people's nights, a vessel for something that those people described in language that bordered on the sacred. She did not think of herself as doing anything special. She was, as she had told a journalist who had once asked her about her calling, simply a woman who read aloud. The journalist had seemed disappointed by this answer, had probed for something deeper, a personal history of insomnia, perhaps, or a transformative experience with audiobooks, or a spiritual practice of some kind. But Alina had nothing to offer in those directions. She slept well herself, always had. She had no dramatic story about discovering the healing power of spoken words. She had simply begun recording one evening, on a whim, using equipment that her son had given her as a gift. And the recordings had found their audience through the mysterious algorithms that governed such things. And that was the entire story. But the messages kept coming, and they kept saying the same thing in different words. That there was something in Alina's reading of Winnie-the Pooh that went beyond the mechanics of sleep induction. Something that touched a place in the listener that was not the mind, but something deeper and older and less easily named. And Alina, who was not given to mystical thinking, and who had no patience for the vague, feel-good language that proliferated online, found herself unable to dismiss these reports entirely. Something was happening. She was not sure what it was, but it was happening, and it was happening through her voice. And the story she was telling when it happened most reliably was the story of a bear named Winnie-the Pooh. She began, in the weeks that followed the recording's publication, to think more carefully about why this particular story seemed to have this particular effect. She had read many books for her recordings, novels, short stories, essays, poetry, natural history. And while all of them had helped people sleep, none had generated the volume or the intensity of response that Winnie-the Pooh had. There was something about this book, something that Milne had put into it, or that had grown into it over the nearly 100 years since its publication, that resonated with sleep-deprived people in a way that other books did not. Alina thought about this as she went about her days. She thought about it while she walked to the village to buy groceries, the narrow lane winding between hedgerows that were just beginning to show the first tentative green of spring. She thought about it while she cooked her meals, which were simple and not particularly adventurous, but which she prepared with the same quiet attention that she brought to her reading, as though the act of chopping an onion or stirring a pot of soup deserved the same care as the act of speaking a sentence aloud. She thought about it while she sat in her garden in the late afternoon, watching the light change as the sun moved behind the old oak tree that stood at the bottom of the lawn. its branches spreading wide like arms that had been reaching toward the sky for so long that they had forgotten why they started. And gradually, over the course of several weeks, a theory began to form in her mind. It was not a scientific theory. Alina had no training in psychology or neuroscience and would not have pretended to. But it was a theory born of long observation and careful thought, and it went something like this. Winnie-the Pooh worked for sleep because it was a book about a world in which nothing truly bad could happen, and in which the characters knew that nothing truly bad could happen, and in which this knowledge allowed them to live with a kind of relaxed confidence that was, for most adults, an almost unimaginable luxury. This was not the same thing as saying that nothing bad happened in the 100-acre wood. Bad things happened all the time. Pooh got stuck indoors. Piglet was surrounded by water. Eeyore lost his tail. Roo was kidnapped, or nearly. The forest flooded. Honey was eaten by the wrong person. Balloons burst. Expeditions failed to reach their destinations. Misunderstandings proliferated. Plans went awry. The world of the 100-acre wood was, in many respects, a world of gentle but persistent disaster. And this was the crucial, but these disasters were never catastrophic. They were never world-ending. They were never the kind of events that shattered the underlying fabric of reality and left the characters adrift in a void of meaninglessness. They were, instead, the kind of events that could be survived, that could be learned from, that could even, in retrospect, be laughed about. They were inconveniences, not tragedies, and the characters treated them as such, not because they were foolish or naive, but because they had, whether by instinct or by experience, arrived at a profoundly accurate assessment of what life was actually like. Life, as Pooh understood it, was a series of small difficulties interspersed with small pleasures, and the proper response to the difficulties was not despair but perseverance, and the proper response to the pleasures was not anxiety about their eventual end, but gratitude for their present reality. Pooh did not worry about tomorrow because tomorrow had not happened yet and therefore did not exist. And Pooh saw no point in worrying about things that did not exist. He worried about honey when there was a shortage of it because honey existed and was real and was immediately relevant to his well-being. But even his worry about honey was not the grinding, corrosive kind of worry that kept people awake at night. It was a gentle worry, a manageable worry, the kind of worry that could be set aside if something more interesting came along. And this, Alina thought, was what her listeners were responding to. Not the specific adventures of the specific animals, but the underlying emotional atmosphere of the book, the atmosphere of safety, of containment, of the reassuring certainty that no matter what happened, the world would remain fundamentally intact, and the characters characters would remain fundamentally themselves, and Christopher Robin would, in the end, make everything all right. Adults, Alina reflected, did not live in this kind of world. They lived in a world of mortgages and deadlines and diagnoses and geopolitical crises and climate change and the 1,000 other large, abstract threats that hovered at the edges of consciousness like storm clouds on a distant horizon. They carried these threats with them into the night, and when they lay down to sleep, the threats did not disappear, but instead intensified, filling the silence with their vague, formless menace. The adult mind, left to its own devices in the dark, was a remarkably efficient generator of anxiety. And it was this anxiety, not the absence of fatigue, but the presence of fear, that kept people awake. But when Alina's voice began to speak, and when the words it spoke were the words of Winnie the Pooh, something shifted. The vague, formless threats were replaced by specific, manageable problems. A missing tail, a stuck bear, a flooded forest. And these problems existed in a context. The 100-acre wood that was itself a kind of sanctuary, a bounded space with clear edges and known inhabitants, and rules that, while not always explicitly stated, could be felt and relied upon. The listener's mind, presented with this alternative world, could step into it the way one steps into a warm bath. Gradually, with a sigh of relief, letting the heat seep into muscles that had been clenched for so long that the clenching had become normal. And once inside that world, the mind could begin to relax its grip on the anxieties of the real world, not because those anxieties had been solved, they had not, but because they had been temporarily displaced by something that was, in its own modest way, more real. The missing tail was more real in the moment of hearing about it than the mortgage. The stuck bear was more real than the deadline. The flooded forest was more real than the diagnosis, not because these things were actually more important, but because they were present and vivid and emotionally coherent. And the anxious mind, given something specific to hold on to, would release its grip on the vague and the abstract without being asked to. This was the gift that Milne had given, Alina decided, and it was a gift that had nothing to do with children and everything to do with human beings of any age who found themselves in need of a place where the dangers were small and the friendships were large, and the worst thing that could happen was that you would have to wait a week to be pulled out of a rabbit hole. It was, she thought, a kind of literary equivalent of a weighted blanket. It did not change the world. It did not solve problems. It simply pressed down, gently and evenly, on the restless, churning surface of the mind, until that surface grew calm enough to reflect the sky. In the 3rd week after the recording's publication, Alina received a message that was longer than most, and that, from its first sentence, announced itself as different from the others. It was from a man named David, and it began, "I am writing to you because I don't know who else to write to, and because your voice is the last thing I heard before I made a decision that I have been putting off for 3 years." Alina read the message slowly, as she read everything, and what she learned was this. David was 57 years old and lived in a small town in Wales. He had been married for 29 years to a woman named Helen, who had died of cancer 3 years ago. Since Helen's death, David had not been able to sleep in the bed they had shared, and so he had been sleeping in the spare room on a narrow bed that was too short for him, and that reminded him, every time he lay down on it, of a hospital cot. He had tried returning to the marital bed on several occasions, but each time he had lain there in the dark and felt the absence of Helen beside him with a force that was physical in its intensity, as though someone had cut a hole in the mattress, and the hole went all the way through the floor and into the earth itself, and he was falling through it. He had tried sleeping pills, which left him numb and foggy the next day. He had tried counseling, which had helped him understand his grief, but had not helped him sleep. He had tried drinking, which had helped him sleep, but had also helped him start drinking during the day. And he had recognized that path and turned away from it before it went too far. He had tried exercise, which made him tired, but did not make him sleepy, as though his body were willing to rest, but his mind refused to grant permission. Then he had found Alina's recordings, and he had started listening to them in the spare room, and they had helped to a degree. He could sleep for 4 or 5 hours, which was better than the 2 or 3 he had been managing before. But he still could not return to the marital bed, and the spare room was becoming a kind of prison, a physical manifestation of his inability to move forward. And he knew that as long as he remained in that room, on that too short bed, he was not really living, but merely waiting. And he did not know what he was waiting for. Then, 3 nights ago, he had listened to the Winnie-the-Pooh recording, and something had shifted. He could not explain what it was or why it happened. He had been listening to the chapter about Eeyore's birthday, the one with the burst balloon and the empty honey pot. And he had found himself thinking about Helen, not about her death, not about the illness, not about the terrible months of watching her fade, but about Helen herself, about the way she laughed, about the way she sang off-key in the kitchen, about the way she had once, for no particular reason, bought him a balloon, a simple red balloon, and had given it to him at breakfast and had said, "This is because it's Tuesday." And he had laughed and tied the balloon to the back of his chair, and it had stayed there for days, bobbing gently every time he moved, until eventually it deflated, and he had thrown it away without thinking about it. But now, listening to Alina read about Eeyore receiving a burst balloon and choosing to treasure it, David remembered the red balloon, and he remembered Helen's face when she gave it to him, and he felt something that he had not felt since her death. Not happiness, exactly, but something adjacent to happiness, something that existed in the same neighborhood and could see happiness's house from its window. It was the feeling that a gift, even a small and ultimately temporary one, could be a genuine expression of love, and that the love did not diminish when the gift was gone, any more than a song diminished when it stopped playing. And that night, for the first time in 3 years, David had walked into the marital bedroom, lain down on the marital bed, and slept. He had slept for 8 hours. He had woken once in the middle of the night and had felt the empty space beside him. But instead of falling into it, he had reached under his pillow and found his phone, still playing Alina's recording, and he had focused on the voice and on the words and on the small, safe world that the words described, and he had fallen back asleep. He was writing, he said, not to thank Alina, though he did thank her, but to tell her that she had given him back his bed, and that giving someone back their bed was, when you thought about it, a remarkable thing to do with nothing more than your voice and a children's story. Alina read David's message twice. Then she sat very still for a long time, looking out the window at the garden, where the spring flowers were beginning to emerge from the soil with the slow determination of creatures who knew that the world above was worth the effort of climbing toward. She did not cry, but she felt something move inside her, something that she could not have named if she had tried, something that was larger than sadness and smaller than joy, and that existed, she thought, in the same territory as the feeling that Milne had captured in the final chapter of his book, the feeling of standing in an enchanted place and knowing that the enchantment would not last, and being grateful for it anyway. She composed a reply to David. It took her a long time, longer than usual, because she wanted to get it right. She did not want to be glib or sentimental or falsely cheerful. She did not want to say, I'm sure Helen would be proud of you, or she's always with you, or any of the other things that people said to the grieving that were meant to comfort, but that often had the opposite effect, because they required the griever to perform a kind of emotional labor, to accept the platitude, to nod, to say, thank you, that helps, that they were too exhausted to perform. What she wrote, after several false starts, was this: Dear David, thank you for telling me about Helen and the red balloon. I think you are right that giving someone back their bed is a remarkable thing, but I suspect that I did not give it back to you. I think you gave it back to yourself, and that the recording was simply the permission you needed to do what you were already ready to do. The bed was always there. Helen was always there, in the way that people we have loved are always there, not beside us, but inside us, in the places where they lived while they were alive. I am glad you are back in your bed. I am glad you slept. Good night. She read the message over, considered it, decided that it was as close to right as she could get, and sent it. The weeks continued to pass, and spring deepened into early summer, and the cottage, which had been quiet all winter, began to fill with the sounds of the season. Bird song in the morning, the hum of bees in the afternoon. Alina had begun to think of them as Pooh's bees, which was silly, but which she could not stop herself from doing. The distant lowing of cattle from the farm on the other side of the valley. Alina opened the windows and let the sounds in, and they mixed with the sound of her voice as she recorded, creating a natural acoustic backdrop that her listeners sometimes commented on. "I can hear birds in the background," they would say. "Or is that a real fire I hear?" And that Alina had learned not to edit out, because it added another layer of texture to the recording, another connection to the real world that existed outside the story and outside the listener's room. She recorded other books during this time. She recorded The House at Pooh Corner, the second of Winnie-the Pooh books, which she had always thought was even better than the first, though she would never have said so publicly, because she did not want to diminish the affection that people felt for the original. She recorded Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows, which was a longer and more linguistically complex book, but which rewarded slow reading in ways that were similar to, if less concentrated than, the Pooh stories. She recorded a collection of essays by the naturalist W.H. Hudson, whose prose had a measured, observational quality that lent itself beautifully to the sleep-reading format. But it was the Winnie-the Pooh recording that continued to draw the most listeners and the most responses. It became, over the course of the spring and early summer, her most popular recording by a significant margin, and it developed something that she had not anticipated, a community of repeat listeners. These were people who did not listen to the recording once and move on, but who returned to it night after night, the way one returns to a favorite chair or a familiar view from a window. They knew the story by heart. They could anticipate each word, each sentence, each chapter. And yet they listened anyway, not for the content, but for the experience, the way one might listen to a piece of music that one has heard 1,000 times, not to discover what comes next, but to inhabit the space that the music creates. Alina found this phenomenon fascinating and slightly mysterious. She understood, in the abstract, the concept of repeated listening. She had her own recordings that she returned to, pieces of music or spoken word that she played not for information, but for comfort. But she had not expected it to apply to a children's book, or at least not to this extent. She received messages from people who told her they had listened to the recording 50 times, 100 times more. A woman in Toronto wrote to say that she had listened to it every night for 6 months, and that she now associated certain passages so strongly with the feeling of falling asleep that she only had to think of them. The description of Pooh's house, the bit about the heffalump trap, the final lines about the enchanted place, to feel her eyelids grow heavy. This was, Alina realized, a form of conditioning, and it was both remarkable and, in a way, touching. The listeners had, through repeated exposure, trained their brains to associate her voice and Milna's words with the onset of sleep, and the association had become so strong that the words alone, without the voice, were enough to trigger it. They had, in effect, internalized the recording, carrying it inside themselves like a private lullaby that they could sing to themselves whenever the need arose. And this, she thought, was perhaps the truest measure of what she was doing. Not the number of downloads, or the length of the recordings, or the volume of messages, but the degree to which the recordings became unnecessary, the degree to which they taught the listeners, through gentle repetition, to do for themselves what she had been doing for them. The ultimate goal of a sleep recording, she had come to believe, was to make itself obsolete, to train the listener over time to fall asleep without it, to become not a crutch, but a bridge, a structure that was crossed and then left behind on the other side of the river, in the land of natural, unassisted sleep. She knew that not all of her listeners would reach this point. Some of them had chronic insomnia that went deeper than any recording could reach, and they would need her voice, or something like it, for as long as they slept. Others simply enjoyed the experience of being read to and had no desire to give it up, and that was fine too. There was no rule that said you had to outgrow a comfort simply because you had outgrown the age at which you first found it. But for those who did reach the point of independence, who lay down one night and realized, halfway through the first chapter, that they did not need to keep listening because they were already asleep. For those listeners, Alina felt a particular pride. The pride of a teacher watching a student ride a bicycle for the first time, wobbling, and then steadying, and then pedaling away, not looking back. One evening in late June, Alina received a telephone call from her daughter, Catherine. Catherine lived in Bristol with her husband and 2 children, Alina's grandchildren, who were 8 and 5, and who called her Nell, because that was what their mother had called her when she was small, and the name had stuck. Catherine called every Sunday evening, and the conversation followed a predictable pattern. Updates on the children, updates on work, updates on whatever project Catherine was currently involved in, followed by a brief exchange about Alina's health and activities, followed by a warm but slightly rushed goodbye, because Catherine was always busy, and Sunday evening was the boundary between the weekend and the working week. But this Sunday evening, the conversation took a different turn. Catherine had, she explained, been having trouble sleeping. Not severe trouble, she was not. She emphasized an insomniac, and she did not want to make more of it than it was, but a persistent difficulty in falling asleep that had developed over the past few months, and that she attributed, somewhat vaguely, to stress at work and the children and everything. She had tried various remedies, none of which had worked. And then, with a mixture of embarrassment and amusement that Alina could hear clearly in her voice, she had started listening to her mother's recordings. And, Alina said, "And they work," Catherine said. "They work really well, actually. I fall asleep within 20 minutes. Every time." "That's good," Alina said. "I've been listening to the Pooh recording," Catherine said. "The one you did a few months ago." "Yes. Mum, I didn't know, I knew you did recordings, but I didn't know what they were like. I'd never actually listened to one before. Not properly. I'd played a few seconds of one once, just to see what you sounded like, but I didn't really listen. And what do you think?" There was a pause. Alina could hear Catherine breathing on the other end of the line, and she could hear, in the background, the sounds of the children getting ready for bed, the splash of water from a bathroom, a small voice asking a question, Catherine's husband murmuring a reply. "I think," Catherine said slowly, "that I understand why people write to you the way they do. It's not just that your voice is calming, although it is. It's that you read it as though it matters, as though every word is important, as though you're not reading a children's book, but telling someone something that they need to hear." Alina did not say anything for a moment. She was touched, more touched than she wanted to admit, because admitting it would mean acknowledging that her daughter's approval mattered to her in a way that no stranger's approval could. And that acknowledgement felt, in the complicated emotional economy of motherhood, like a kind of vulnerability that she was not sure she was ready to permit herself. "I read it the way I read everything," she said finally. "The same way." "I know," Catherine said. "That's what I mean. You read everything as though it matters. The Pooh book, the Graham book, the essays, they all sound the same. They all sound like you're taking them seriously. And that's extraordinary. Because most people don't take things seriously. They skim. They rush. They treat everything as though it's just a means to an end. But you don't. You treat the words as though they're the end, as though the reading itself is the point." Alina sat in her armchair, the phone pressed to her ear, and felt a warmth spread through her chest that was not unlike the feeling of sitting in front of a fire on a cold evening. She did not respond immediately because she did not trust her voice to be steady. "The children have been listening too," Catherine added, her tone shifting to something lighter. "Oliver, he's the 8-year-old. He's been listening to the Pooh recording at bedtime. He says he likes your voice better than the other audiobooks because you don't do funny voices. He doesn't like funny voices. He says funny voices are annoying. He says they're trying too hard. His words, I don't know where he gets it from. Alina laughed, a quiet, genuine laugh that she felt all the way down to her stomach. He gets it from me, she said. Yes, Catherine said. I suppose he does. They talked for a while longer about the children and about Catherine's work and about the small, necessary details of shared family life. When they said goodbye, Alina sat in her chair for a long time after the line went dead, holding the phone in her lap, thinking about Oliver and about the fact that her grandson, who could have listened to any of the thousands of audiobooks available online, had chosen hers. Not because it was exciting or funny or adventurous, but because it did not try too hard. Because it was, in the word of an 8-year-old, not annoying. She thought about that word, annoying, and about what it meant in this context. An annoying voice was a voice that demanded attention, that pulled and pushed and insisted on being noticed. An annoying voice was a voice that was performing, that was trying to be something other than what it was. An annoying voice was, in the deepest sense, a voice that did not trust the words it was speaking, that believed the words needed help to be heard, and that provided that help in the form of vocal gymnastics, emotional manipulation, and artificial energy. Her voice was not annoying because it did none of these things. It trusted the words. It let them be what they were. It spoke them quietly and clearly and without embellishment. And in doing so, it allowed the listener to hear the words directly, without the interference of a performer's ego getting in the way. It was, Alina thought, the literary equivalent of a clear window. You did not notice the glass because you were looking through it at the view beyond. And the view, in this case, was a forest where a bear lived. And the bear was looking for honey. And the sun was shining. And everything, for the moment, was exactly as it should be. July came, and with it a heat wave that made the cottage warm even at night. Alina, who had never owned an air conditioner and saw no reason to start now, coped with the heat by opening all the windows and by sleeping on top of her bedclothes rather than under them. She also, unconsciously, adjusted her reading schedule, recording later in the evening when the air had cooled slightly, and her voice was at its most relaxed. During this period, she began to notice something new in the messages she received. Several listeners reported that the Winnie-the Pooh recording had become a shared experience in their households, not just a private, solitary thing done with headphones in the dark, but something that was listened to together by couples or by parents and children as a kind of collective bedtime ritual. A man in Amsterdam wrote to say that he and his wife, who had been sleeping in separate rooms because of his snoring, had started listening to the recording together in the living room before going to bed, and that the shared experience of lying on the sofa in the dark, listening to Alina read about Pooh, had somehow bridged the distance that the snoring had created, and that they were now sleeping in the same room again, with the recording playing softly in the background to mask the sound of his breathing. A woman in Vancouver wrote to say that she had started playing the recording for her elderly father, who suffered from dementia and who became agitated and confused at night, often wandering the house and calling out for people who were not there. Since she had begun playing the recording at a low volume in his room, his nighttime agitation had decreased significantly. He did not understand the story. His dementia was too advanced for that. But the sound of Alina's voice, steady and calm and unchanging, seemed to anchor him, to give him something fixed and reliable in a world that had become, for him, unpredictable and frightening. He would lie in bed and listen, and his breathing would slow, and his hands, which often clenched and unclenched in frustration, would relax, and he would sleep. Alina read this message several times, and each time she read it, she felt something tighten in her chest. She thought about the old man in Vancouver, alone in his room with his failing mind, and about the voice that reached him through the darkness and told him, in words he could no longer fully understand, that there was a bear who lived in a wood, and that the bear had friends, and that the friends looked after each other, and that everything, in the end, was all right. She thought about the daughter who had found this recording, and who had played it for her father not because anyone had told her to, but because she had heard it herself and had recognized, with the instinctive intelligence of someone who loves another person, that it would help. She thought about the strange, beautiful, almost miraculous chain of events that had led to this moment. Milne writing the book in the 1920s, Shepard drawing the illustrations, the book being published and becoming famous and being read to generations of children. And then, nearly a century later, a retired woman in the English countryside sitting in an armchair and reading it aloud into a microphone, and the recording traveling through cables and satellites and servers to a house in Vancouver where an old man with dementia lay in bed and listened to a voice that told him, in the language of a children's story, that he was safe. It was absurd if you thought about it. It was also, if you thought about it, the most natural thing in the world. Stories had always traveled this way from mouth to ear, from heart to heart, across distances of time and space that would have seemed impossible if you tried to measure them. But that seemed, in the moment of telling and hearing, as small and traversable as the distance between a speaker's lips and a listener's ear. Alina replied to the woman in Vancouver with her usual brevity. "Thank you for telling me about your father. I am glad the recording helps. Please give him my love. if you think he would like that. Good night. She suspected he would not know what my love meant, coming from a stranger. But she also suspected that it did not matter, because the love was not in the words, but in the voice that spoke them. And the voice had already said everything it needed to say. The summer passed. Alina continued to record, continued to read, continued to receive messages from listeners who found in her voice a passage to sleep. The Pooh recording accumulated listens at a rate that surprised even her, and it developed a life of its own online, being shared and recommended and discussed in forums and chat groups that Alina knew nothing about, and that she was content to know nothing about. She did not read the comments sections where her recordings were discussed. She did not look at the analytics that told her how many people had listened, or for how long, or in which countries. She trusted the process of reading, of recording, of publishing, and left the rest to whatever mysterious forces governed the distribution of digital content in the 21st century. But occasionally, a message would arrive that pulled her up short, that reminded her that what she was doing was not routine, not ordinary, not simply the mechanical repetition of a task she had performed hundreds of times before. One such message came in late August from a woman named Priya, who lived in a city in southern India and who wrote in English that was precise and formal and deeply felt. Priya wrote that she was a new mother. Her baby was 4 months old and did not sleep well, waking every 2 hours throughout the night. And Priya, who was also working full-time from home, had reached a state of exhaustion that she described, with the careful understatement of someone who had learned that complaining did not help, as difficult. She had tried everything: rocking, walking, singing, white noise, co-sleeping, separate sleeping. And nothing had worked for more than a night or two. The baby, it seemed, was simply a baby. And Bobbies, as Priya had quickly learned, operated according to rules that no amount of planning or preparation could anticipate or control. Then one night at 3 in the morning, when the baby had woken for the 4th time, and Priya was sitting in the dark with the baby in her arms, too tired to rock, too tired to walk, too tired even to cry. She had put on her headphones, one ear only, the ear closest to the baby, so that she could hear if the baby needed her, and had played the Winnie-the Pooh recording. And the baby, to her absolute astonishment, had stopped crying. Not immediately, not as though a switch had been flipped, but gradually, over the course of several minutes, the way a storm subsides. First the violent part, then the grumbling part, then the quiet part, and then the stillness. The baby had fallen asleep in her arms while Alina read about Pooh visiting Rabbit, and Priya had sat there in the dark, listening to the rest of the chapter, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid that any disturbance would break the spell. but the spell held. The baby slept, and Priya, sitting motionless in the dark, with her sleeping child in her arms and Aliner's voice in her ear, had felt something that she could only describe as a kind of grace. A sudden, unearned gift of peace that had arrived not because she had earned it or deserved it, but simply because it was there, in the words and in the voice, waiting to be received. She had used the recording every night since. It did not work every time. The baby was still a baby, and bobbies were still unpredictable. But it worked often enough to make the nights manageable. And the making manageable of the nights had, Priya wrote, saved her sanity and possibly her marriage, and certainly her ability to continue functioning as a working mother and a human being. She ended the message with a question. Why do you think it works for bobbies? They cannot understand the words. They do not know what a bear is, or a forest, or honey. And yet your voice calms them. Why? Aliner read the question and sat with it for a long time. She thought about bobbies, about the extraordinary sensitivity of their nervous systems, about the way they processed sound not as information, but as texture, as vibration, as a kind of physical sensation that was closer to touch than to hearing. She thought about how a baby in the womb hears the mother's heartbeat, a sound that is continuous and rhythmic and deeply associated with safety, and about how the transition from that sound to the sounds of the outside world, which are discontinuous and irregular and often loud, is one of the most jarring experiences a human being can have. And she thought about her voice and about the qualities it possessed that might mimic, however imperfectly, the qualities of a heartbeat, its steadiness, its regularity, its unchanging warmth. She was not, she knew, a heartbeat, but she was perhaps the next best thing, a continuous, rhythmic, warm sound that told the baby's nervous system, in the only language the nervous system understood at that age, that everything was all right, that the world was safe, that there was no need to cry. But there was something else, she thought, something beyond the purely physiological. Bobbies, she believed, could hear emotion in a voice even when they could not understand the words that carried it. They could hear love. They could hear gentleness. They could hear the quality of attention that the speaker was bringing to the act of speaking. And they could distinguish between a voice that was present and a voice that was distracted, between a voice that cared and a voice that was merely going through the motions. And her voice, when she read Winnie-the Pooh, was as present and as caring as she knew how to make it, because she loved the book, and she loved the act of reading it, and she loved, in a diffuse and impersonal, but nonetheless real way, the people who were listening to it. She wrote back to Priya, I think your baby hears not the words, but the feeling behind the words. And the feeling is love, not love for the baby specifically. I don't know your baby, but love for the story and for the act of telling it. and bobbies can tell the difference between a voice that loves what it is saying and a voice that does not. Your baby can tell. That is why it works. She paused, then added, also, I think bobbies like the sound of my voice because it is old. Old voices are slow and steady, like heartbeats that have been beating for a long time and are in no hurry to stop. Young voices are exciting. Old voices are safe. Your baby wants to feel safe. My voice tells your baby that it is safe. That is all I know. Good night. Autumn arrived. The leaves on the trees around the cottage turned from green to gold to red to brown. And then, one by one, they let go and fell to the ground, where they formed a thick, rustling carpet that crunched under Aline's feet when she walked to the village. The air grew cooler, and the light grew softer, and the evenings drew in, and Aline, who had always loved autumn, found herself reading with a particular pleasure that she attributed to the match between the season and the book. For Winnie-the Pooh, she had come to believe, was an autumn book. Not in the literal sense. Its setting was not tied to any particular season, but in the emotional sense. There was a quality of mellow richness in the stories, a sense of abundance that was tinged with the knowledge of loss, a warmth that existed not in spite of the approaching cold, but because of it, the way the last warm days of autumn feel warmer precisely because you know they will not last. She recorded the book again, from beginning to end, not because the original recording was deficient, but because she wanted to capture what she thought of as the autumn version, the same words, the same voice, but infused with the particular quality of attention that the season evoked. She recorded it over the course of 3 evenings, sitting in her armchair with the window open and the sound of the wind in the trees mixing with the sound of her voice. And when she was done, she published it alongside the original with a note that said simply, "Another reading for another season." The autumn version attracted its own audience, and some listeners reported a preference for it over the original, while others preferred the original and found the autumn version too melancholy. A few listeners wrote to say that they alternated between the two, using the original in the spring and summer, and the autumn version in the fall and winter, as though the recordings were seasonal items of clothing to be stored and retrieved according to the weather. Aline was pleased by this. She liked the idea that the same story could sound different at different times of year, not because the words changed, but because the person reading them and the person hearing them had changed. It was, she thought, a reminder that a story was not a fixed object, but a living thing, something that grew and shifted and took on new colors depending on the light that was falling on it. Winnie-the Pooh was not the same book in June as it was in October, just as Aline was not the same person at 60 as she had been at 6. And the meeting of the book and the reader was not a static event, but a dynamic one, a conversation that continued across the years, each reading adding something to the accumulated meaning of all the readings that had come before. She sat in her armchair on a late October evening, the fire burning in the grate for the first time since spring, and looked at the copy of Winnie-the Pooh on the table beside her. The book was open now. She had been reading it earlier, just for herself, not for recording, and had left it open to the page where Pooh and Piglet are walking through the snow, looking for woozles. And Piglet says that it is a very anxious sort of thing to be a very small animal entirely surrounded by snow. Alina looked at the illustration Shepherd's drawing of Piglet, tiny and pink, and slightly bewildered, standing in a vast white landscape. And she thought about all the people, all over the world, who had looked at this same illustration over the past 100 years, and who had felt, as she felt now, a surge of protective affection for this small creature who was frightened, but who was walking anyway, because his friend was beside him, and because walking was what you did when you were looking for something, even if you were not sure what that something was, or whether it existed at all. She closed the book gently, as though closing the door of a small house where someone was sleeping, and she let her hand rest on the cover for a moment, feeling the raised texture of the illustration beneath her fingertips. The bear looked up at her from the cover with his perpetual expression of hopeful incomprehension, and Alina, looking down at him, felt the familiar warmth in her chest, the warmth that had become, over the months of reading his story aloud, as reliable and as necessary as the fire in the grate. "Good night, Pooh," she said quietly, and then she turned off the lamp, and the cottage was dark, and outside the wind moved through the bare branches of the trees with a sound like long, slow breathing, and the night settled over the countryside like a great, soft blanket. And everywhere, in bedrooms, and hospital rooms and hotel rooms, and lonely apartments, in cribs and in cars, and in the arms of tired mothers, people were sleeping. And somewhere in their sleep, if they were lucky, there was a forest. And in the forest there was a house. And over the door of the house, in gold letters, was a name. And the name was Sanders. And inside the house, if you looked very carefully, you might see a small bear sitting in a chair, eating honey from a pot. And the bear was happy, and that was enough. That was always enough. And